By the mid-19th century, cotton was king. The sprawling plantations of the American South produced nearly 3/4 of the world's supply, fueling the textile mills of Britain, the factories of the North, and the fortunes of merchants across Europe. Cotton became the engine of the modern world, clothing millions, driving industrial revolutions, and building empires of unimaginable wealth. But behind this white gold was a system of brutality. It was not innovation or free enterprise that made the Cotton Kingdom flourish. It was chains. Every pound of cotton carried the weight of forced labor. Enslaved men, women, and children toiled from dawn until nightfall under the blistering sun, whipped into submission, their lives reduced to a ledger line on an overseer's account. Their hands bled so that merchants could profit. Their backs broke so that America's economy could rise. What the world celebrated as prosperity was in truth built on suffering. And while the cotton itself was shipped across oceans, the human cost was buried, silenced, and erased from the story of progress. But the truth cannot remain hidden. The Cotton Kingdom was not simply agriculture, it was an empire of forced labor, and its legacy still runs through global systems of wealth and inequality today. This is the story of how slavery built the Cotton Kingdom, and how the Cotton Kingdom built the modern world. In the early years of the 19th century, the United States was a young nation searching for its economic identity. The revolution had secured independence, but prosperity was far from guaranteed. The northern states leaned toward industry, shipbuilding, and commerce, while the South remained largely agricultural, dependent on crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. But these were crops with limits. Soils grew exhausted, and global demand shifted. Then, almost suddenly, a single plant transformed the destiny of the nation: cotton. Cotton was not new to the Americas, but the Industrial Revolution in Britain had created an insatiable appetite for it. Textile mills in Manchester, Liverpool, and beyond churned out cloth that clothed the world, and they required mountains of raw fiber to keep their machines spinning. By 1800, Britain alone imported over 50 million pounds of cotton annually. The United States, with its warm climate and vast southern fields, was perfectly positioned to become the global supplier. But such production required more than fertile soil, it required labor. And so, cotton became inseparable from slavery. The phrase, "cotton is king," first coined by Southern politicians, was more than a boast. It was a declaration of dependence. The South relied on cotton, and cotton relied on enslaved labor. By 1860, the United States produced nearly 75% of the world's cotton. New Orleans became one of the richest cities on earth, its markets overflowing with bales of white fiber. Merchants in New York financed the trade. Ships carried the crop across the Atlantic. Empires profited. And at the very root of this empire stood millions of enslaved men, women, and children whose forced labor turned fields into fortunes. The Cotton Kingdom was not simply agriculture. It was an economic empire, stretching from the fields of Mississippi and Alabama to the counting houses of London and the factories of New England. Its wealth was visible in plantation mansions, bustling ports, and the booming textile industry. Its true cost, however, was written on the broken bodies of those who planted, picked, and suffered to sustain it. The rise of the Cotton Kingdom was meteoric, but its foundation was chains. What the world celebrated as prosperity was, in truth, a system built on forced labor. And that system would shape not only the American South, but the modern world itself. If cotton was the crown of the Southern economy, enslaved people were its foundation. Every bale, every fortune, every brick of wealth built in the Cotton Kingdom came from the labor of those who had no choice. The workforce that powered this empire did not earn wages, did not rest when exhausted, and did not share in the prosperity they created. Instead, they lived and died in fields of white fiber, their humanity denied and their labor stolen. From dawn to dusk, the cotton fields demanded relentless toil. Enslaved men, women, and even children were driven into the rows before sunrise, often working 18-hour days during harvest. Overseers rode horseback with whips at the ready, measuring productivity not in dignity or health, but in pounds of cotton picked. Those who slowed, resisted, or faltered faced brutal punishment, lashings, shackles, or worse. Cotton was counted, lives were not. The work itself was punishing. Planting required digging holes in unforgiving soil, dropping seeds and covering them row after row. Harvest season was worse. Cotton bolls tore at the fingers, leaving hands raw and bloody. A strong worker might be forced to pick 200 pounds in a single day, the sack dragging heavy against their shoulders. At night, instead of rest, many still faced additional labor, tending animals, repairing tools, or serving in the master's household. Children were not spared. From the moment they could walk, they carried water, scared birds from fields, or helped with smaller tasks. Their futures were shaped by chains, growing into the same cycle of exhaustion that bound their parents. Families lived under constant threat of separation, as individuals could be sold at any moment to satisfy a master's debt or greed. Yet, in the face of this brutality, enslaved people resisted. Some slowed their pace deliberately, feigning illness or damaging tools. Others preserved their strength in hidden ways, through song, through faith, through moments of joy stolen in the shadows. Spirituals sung in the fields were more than music. They were messages of hope, resistance, and survival. Even in the cotton rows, the human spirit found ways to endure. The Cotton Kingdom portrayed itself as a world of wealth, elegance, and prosperity. But that illusion was built upon the backs of a workforce stripped of freedom. Enslaved people were not simply laborers, they were the true builders of the Cotton Kingdom. Their toil lined the pockets of planters, merchants, and industrialists around the world. And their suffering, though often erased in ledgers and history books, remains the hidden cost of global wealth. In 1793, Eli Whitney introduced a machine that would change the course of history: the cotton gin. A simple device of wooden rollers, wire teeth, and brushes, it was designed to strip seeds from short staple cotton, a task that once consumed endless hours of manual labor. With the gin, what took a worker an entire day could now be done in minutes. For many, this seemed like progress, innovation, even liberation. But in the Cotton Kingdom, the cotton gin did not loosen chains, it tightened them. Before Whitney's invention, cotton was cultivated in limited regions because removing seeds from the tough fibers was slow and inefficient. Planters experimented with rice, indigo, and tobacco, but each crop had its limits. The gin changed everything. Suddenly, vast stretches of southern land, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and beyond, became fertile ground for profitable cotton production. And with the boom came an insatiable demand for labor. Rather than diminishing the need for enslaved people, the cotton gin multiplied it. Fields expanded rapidly, swallowing forests and displacing indigenous nations. Planters purchased enslaved men, women, and children in unprecedented numbers, driving the domestic slave trade into brutal overdrive. Families were torn apart as traders marched thousands from Virginia and Maryland into the Deep South, their lives commodified to fuel the hunger for more cotton. The machine that made cotton easier to process made slavery more entrenched than ever. By 1860, nearly 4 million people were enslaved in the United States, the majority laboring in cotton. Whitney's invention, hailed as a triumph of ingenuity, became instead an engine of bondage. The cotton gin reveals a hard truth: technology is not inherently progress. In the hands of the Cotton Kingdom, it was twisted into a tool of profit and oppression. Where others saw invention, enslaved people saw their chains multiplied. Every bale of cotton processed faster by the gin meant another acre cleared, another family torn apart, another body whipped into production. Innovation built fortunes, yes, but only because it was paired with forced labor. The cotton gin did not save time for the enslaved, it demanded more of it. It did not reduce suffering, it magnified it. And it reminds us that progress without humanity is no progress at all. The Cotton Kingdom was not just about fields and plantations, it was a vast economic machine. Every fiber picked in the South flowed into a global network of trade, finance, and industry. Cotton linked the plantation to the counting house, the cotton gin to the textile mill, the whip to the banker's pen. Slavery was not a relic of a pre-modern world, it was the beating heart of modern capitalism. Plantations themselves operated like factories. Enslaved people worked in gangs, timed and monitored like industrial workers. Overseers demanded quotas, and planters calculated profits down to the pound of cotton picked. The goal was efficiency, not humanity. Fields became assembly lines under the open sky. But the economy of slavery extended far beyond the plantation. Cotton was collateral for loans. Banks in New York, Boston, and London financed plantations, while insurance companies wrote policies that treated human beings as insurable property. Merchants sold tools, sacks, and clothing to planters, profiting from the very system that stripped others of dignity. Wall Street itself was tied to slavery. Northern financiers invested in Southern cotton, and profits from the trade flowed back into railroads, factories, and urban growth. Even those who never set foot on a plantation often had their wealth connected to it. Cotton, and by extension slavery, fueled the expansion of American capitalism. The impact was global. Ships carried cotton across the Atlantic, where it entered the mills of Manchester and Liverpool. Textile industries across Europe thrived on slave-grown fiber. Finished cloth returned to America and beyond, sold in markets that reached as far as India, China, and Africa. Cotton was not just a southern crop, it was the fabric of global commerce. This economic web revealed an uncomfortable truth. Slavery was not separate from capitalism, but central to it. The Cotton Kingdom showed that profit and cruelty could walk hand in hand. Every banker's contract, every merchant's sale, every industrial boom carried the imprint of chains. To understand the wealth of the modern world, one must trace the threads of cotton and see the blood that stains them. By the mid-19th century, cotton was more than a crop. It was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. From the mills of New England to the sprawling factories of Britain, cotton cloth became the first truly mass-produced commodity, clothing millions across the globe. But every thread spun in those factories began in southern fields, plucked by enslaved hands. In Britain, cities like Manchester and Liverpool rose to prominence on the back of cotton. Their factories consumed millions of pounds each year, and their merchants grew rich shipping cloth across the globe. Streets filled with smoke from steam engines and textile machines roared with relentless speed. Yet few who wore the cheap, abundant fabric understood that it came from toil and terror half a world away. The United States, too, rode this wave. While the South supplied the raw cotton, the North processed it in mills. Lowell, Massachusetts became a model industrial town, with factories powered by cotton grown by enslaved people in Mississippi and Alabama. Northern bankers and shippers prospered, creating a paradox. Many who spoke against slavery still profited from it. Cotton was the bridge between slavery and modern industry. Without it, the pace of the Industrial Revolution would have slowed dramatically. Coal and iron may have powered machines, but cotton gave them purpose. The demand for textiles created the demand for fields, and the demand for fields created the demand for chains. This global system blurred the line between oppressor and beneficiary. Slavery was not confined to plantations. It was woven into the very fabric of industrial society. The shirts on backs in London, the dresses in Paris, the uniforms in Boston, all bore the invisible weight of enslaved labor. The Cotton Kingdom was not just a southern empire, it was a global one, uniting field, factory, and fortune. Its profits reshaped cities, accelerated technology, and clothed the modern world, all while shackling millions in suffering. By the 1830s, cotton was no longer just an American commodity. It was the lifeblood of a global economy. Every bale harvested in the Mississippi Delta connected to ships in New Orleans, markets in Liverpool, looms in Lancashire, and even traders in Asia. The Cotton Kingdom was not an isolated empire. It was the thread that tied nations together in profit and in complicity. Cotton exports from the American South skyrocketed. Britain, the world's leading industrial power, depended on it. More than half of all raw cotton imported into British ports came from enslaved labor in the U.S. The mills of Manchester and Liverpool, symbols of progress and industry, would have ground to a halt without Southern cotton. Britain's empire clothed itself in fabric woven from bondage. France, too, expanded its textile industry on American cotton. Across Europe, merchants and manufacturers leaned on the flow of enslaved labor across the Atlantic. Finished cloth was exported worldwide, to Africa, where it was ironically exchanged for more captives, to Asia, where cheap cotton flooded markets, to the Americas, where it undercut local industries. The ripple effects extended further. Global banks and insurance companies made fortunes underwriting the trade. Shipping firms thrived carrying cotton across seas. Industrialists reinvested profits into steel, railroads, and machinery, building the modern world with wealth rooted in slavery. Cotton was the first truly globalized commodity, binding together continents in a web of production, trade, and exploitation. Its story reveals that slavery was not a regional sin, but an international system. The riches of London, Paris, Boston, and New York all bore the imprint of Southern fields. When we trace the prosperity of the modern West, we cannot ignore the truth. The Cotton Kingdom's wealth was global wealth, and at its foundation were chains that stretched across oceans. For all its power and brutality, the Cotton Kingdom was never uncontested. Enslaved men and women did not accept bondage silently. Across the cotton rows, resistance lived in many forms, from small acts of defiance to bold rebellions. Though planters boasted of control, the enslaved proved again and again that their spirits could not be chained. On the plantations, resistance often began with survival. Enslaved workers slowed their pace, feigned illness, or deliberately broke tools. These silent strikes chipped away at the efficiency planters prized, reminding them that control was never absolute. Songs carried double meanings, hymns of worship that doubled as coded messages of escape. A melody sung in the cotton fields might contain a map, a signal, or a promise of freedom. Escape was another form of resistance. The Underground Railroad offered a dangerous path north, aided by free black communities and white abolitionists. For those in the Deep South, maroon communities in swamps and forests provided refuge. Some fled only briefly, returning under cover of night to see loved ones, refusing to let slavery sever family bonds completely. But resistance also took the form of open rebellion. Though rare, uprisings struck terror into planters. Revolts like Nat Turner's in Virginia or uprisings in Louisiana reminded the South that enslaved people were not passive laborers, but fighters willing to risk everything. Even the fear of rebellion shaped Southern laws, tightening restrictions on movement, gatherings, and even the use of drums, which planters feared as instruments of communication. Daily defiance, spiritual resilience, and outright rebellion together revealed a truth the Cotton Kingdom tried to hide. The enslaved were never broken. They resisted in ways large and small, leaving behind a legacy of courage. The Cotton Kingdom thrived on forced labor, but every stalk of cotton carried with it a hidden story of defiance. Resistance was not the exception. It was woven into the fabric of slavery itself. The Cotton Kingdom was not only an economic power, it was a political force that shaped the destiny of the United States. By the mid-19th century, Southern planters wielded extraordinary influence in Washington. Their wealth, drawn from enslaved labor, translated into votes, laws, and compromises that bent the nation toward the preservation of slavery. The expansion of cotton drove the expansion of slavery into new territories. Each time the nation grew westward, the question arose, would new states be free or slave? The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act all revolved around one issue, the future of the Cotton Kingdom. Planters feared that without new lands to cultivate, their empire would wither. Southern politicians argued that slavery was not merely an economic necessity, but a positive good. They claimed that cotton was the lifeblood of the nation and that enslaved labor was the only way to sustain it. Their voices dominated Congress, shaping legislation and blocking abolitionist efforts. Cotton was not just an agricultural product, it was a weapon wielded in political battles. The North, meanwhile, was torn by contradiction. Many Northerners opposed slavery in principle, yet profited from it in practice through mills, banks, and trade. This uneasy balance fueled growing tensions. Abolitionists raised their voices louder, publishing fiery tracts and helping fugitives escape. Southern leaders, in turn, doubled down, passing harsher laws to protect slavery, including the Fugitive Slave Act. By the 1850s, the nation stood on a knife's edge. Cotton, which had once been hailed as a unifying economic boon, had become the great divider. The Cotton Kingdom's demand for land and labor dragged America closer to conflict, and its political power made compromise increasingly impossible. The Civil War was not born of abstract debates alone. It was born of fields and chains, of cotton bolls and whips. The politics of slavery were the politics of cotton, and together they pushed a young nation toward its greatest rupture. By the 1860s, the Cotton Kingdom stood at the height of its power and on the edge of destruction. For decades, Southern planters had boasted that cotton is king, convinced that the world depended too heavily on their crop for slavery ever to fall. They believed Britain and France would never allow disruption to their supply, and they saw themselves as untouchable. But history had other plans. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 signaled a turning point. Though Lincoln's initial goal was to prevent the expansion of slavery, Southern leaders feared the beginning of its end. One by one, states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederacy, a nation built explicitly on the defense of slavery and cotton. In their minds, secession was survival. The Civil War put the Cotton Kingdom to the test. Confederate leaders gambled on King Cotton diplomacy, cutting exports in hopes that Britain and France would intervene. But the gamble failed. Other regions, Egypt, India, and Brazil, expanded cotton production, while Britain resisted involvement in a war over slavery. The South's greatest weapon became its greatest weakness. As Union armies marched through the South, enslaved people seized the moment. Thousands fled plantations, seeking freedom behind Union lines. Others resisted from within, slowing production and undermining the Confederate economy. Enslaved laborers became freedom fighters, transforming the war into a revolution from below. By 1865, the Confederacy lay in ruins. Plantations burned, markets collapsed, and the cotton economy that once seemed invincible was shattered. The 13th Amendment formally ended slavery, toppling the institution that had built the Cotton Kingdom. But freedom came unevenly. Though chains were broken, poverty, exploitation, and violence remained. Sharecropping and debt peonage replaced slavery for many, ensuring that cotton fields still bound generations in cycles of hardship. The Cotton Kingdom had fallen, but its shadow endured. The empire of cotton was gone, yet its legacy of inequality and racial oppression survived, shaping the Reconstruction era and beyond. The fall of the Cotton Kingdom ended slavery, but it did not erase its legacy. The wealth created by cotton did not disappear with emancipation. It remained in the banks, factories, and fortunes built on centuries of forced labor. The scars of slavery stretched far beyond the fields, leaving marks on America's economy, society, and global order that endure to this day. The South rebuilt under new systems, sharecropping, tenant farming, and debt peonage, which often trapped freed people in conditions strikingly similar to slavery. Cotton remained the cash crop, and the same fields that once echoed with the crack of whips now held families bound by poverty and unfair contracts. Freedom was real, but incomplete. In the North and abroad, industries that had thrived on slave-grown cotton continued to prosper. Mills in Britain and New England remained pillars of industrial wealth. Banks that had financed plantations grew into modern financial giants. Insurance companies and shipping firms built on slave profits became permanent fixtures of the global economy. Slavery ended, but the wealth it created was inherited, not undone. Culturally, the story of the Cotton Kingdom was rewritten to hide its brutality. The lost cause myth painted plantations as noble and slavery as benign, erasing the suffering that had fueled prosperity. Meanwhile, black voices that preserved the truth of chains and resilience were silenced or marginalized. Yet memory persisted. Spirituals, folklore, and oral traditions kept alive the story of how cotton was built on chains. Historians, activists, and descendants continue to challenge the myths, revealing that the modern world's comforts were purchased with stolen lives. Today, echoes of the Cotton Kingdom remain in systemic inequalities, racial divides, and global labor practices that still exploit the vulnerable. The story is not just about the past, it is about the foundations of the present. The Cotton Kingdom built global wealth, but its true legacy is a reminder. Progress built on chains is not progress at all. Until the voices of the enslaved are fully heard and their sacrifices remembered, the story of cotton and of the modern world it created remains unfinished.